Okay. So our next speaker today is Jon Barratt. He's an EM doctor. Today he's going to talk to us about metacognition and the theory behind thinking about thinking. If you could welcome him to the stage.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Grace and Matt, for giving me the opportunity to talk about my favourite subject. So metacognition, thinking about thinking. As Grace said, my name is Jon. I'm an emergency medicine registrar. At the moment, I work in St Mary's in London. I had the immense privilege last year of doing pre-hospital emergency medicine subspecialty training in the east of England, so flying with Magpass and East Anglian Air Ambulance. I'm also lucky enough to still be able to continue my pre-hospital practice with. What I'm actually going to do, though, is show you a story from earlier in my pre-hospital career. So, metacognition, what exactly is it? Well, this is I'll tell you a little bit more about that. Dictionary definition, an awareness and understanding of one's own thought processes. But let's keep it really, really simple. It's thinking about thinking. It's trying to think about why we make the decisions that we do. Okay, so how did I get interested in metacognition and trying to really do that deep dive into my own personal decisions that I made? So it all started off here. Some of you might recognise it. It's the Junction 26 truck stop, just off the M25 outside Waltham Abbey. Not the most salubrious of places. It's not on the Towie tour, if any of you have been on that. But what's the relevance of this to me? So this was after a job when I was responding as a basics doctor. So for any of you who don't know how basics works, it's a network of pre-hospital professionals, doctors, paramedics, and nurses. In the east of England, we're tasked by the critical care desk, the same place that tasked the air ambulances. And the majority of us respond from home. So that was the situation that I was in. I was at my home address, which is about 5 miles away from this location. It was a September evening. It was about 7, 8 p.m. It was already starting to get a little bit dark. And it was absolutely belting it down with rain. I mean, chucking it down. The phone rang. I was asked to respond to a motorcyclist who'd been hit by an oncoming car. I made my way safely to the scene. I arrived. It was cold. It was dark. It was wet. And as you can imagine, you can see from the picture, it's not the most salubrious of areas. Could see a East of England ambulance service, double-manned ambulance, 2 clinicians, police had closed the road. All looked like fairly standard stuff. There was a 50-year-old patient. He'd been thrown from his motorcycle by a car that had been on the wrong side of the road, and he'd landed about 20, 30 feet from the collision. He'd landed in a prone position with his arms outstretched. And normally when we go to these pre-hospital scenes, we're used to seeing our patients on their back, on a scoop, on a stretcher. This patient was still in the position where he'd landed. He was lying face first on the road in this cold and wet conditions, and there was an obvious injury that stood out a mile. He had bilateral open wrist fractures. Not something I'd commonly seen before, but it was a significant distracting injury, and it definitely was occupying the majority of my bandwidth, thinking, how am I going to deal with the fact that this bloke's got both arms completely smashed, both bones, tissue, all sorts of stuff, blood sticking out everywhere. He was in significant pain, as you can imagine, and there was a lot of activity that needed to happen in order to get this patient to where he needed to be, which was to the hospital. There was a monitor to the side of the patient, and the crew assured me that he was hemodynamically normal, and that they'd disconnected the monitoring in order to roll him onto the scoop, and then we could get him onto the truck and we'd reconnect our monitoring. I thought that sounded like a great plan. We'd keep the momentum. We'd roll onto a scoop. We'd put on a pelvic binder based on the mechanism of injury and the potential for serious injury. And then once we got back onto the ambulance and we'd immobilised the injuries, we would reconnect the monitoring. So once we were on the truck, we did that. We connected our monitoring. Sorry, you should just be able to see it. It should start working. So try and immerse yourself now in that situation. You've got your patient, he's packaged, he's got 2 big box splints, one on each arm. Monitoring's on. The blood pressure's cycled about 3 or 4 times at this occasion, but it's been quite difficult to get a cuff the right size to fit on the upper arm, and You can't feel a radial pulse because both wrists are so badly damaged. He's talking, still in significant pain. He's had some IV morphine at this point, and that's the monitoring that we get. So I look at that blood pressure, the diastolic number looks a little bit strange, but I'll accept that systolic. That's better than it being 100 less than 154. And let's start making our way to hospital. So we head off to the Royal London Hospital. Blood pressure cycles 3 or 4 more occasions and keeps coming out with a timeout and lots of different things. We try moving the cuff, maybe try it on the lower leg. Maybe that might give us a more reliable number. The heart rate started to go up, but I still don't think we've fully got on top of this patient's pain because these wrist injuries are so severe. He's also now started to complain of some pain in the lower back, saying that the pelvic binder feels really uncomfortable. And we get another blood pressure with a very high diastolic number, very narrow pulse pressure, but the systolic's still reassuring me. And when I passed the pre-alert to the Royal London Hospital, we're about 10 minutes away at this point, I explained the injuries that we've got. We've got these significant upper limb injuries, suspicion of a possible pelvic fracture, but at the moment, hemodynamically, I still think we're okay. Specifically, for those of you aware of how the major trauma system in London and elsewhere works, about whether or not to declare a code red. The sort of thought went through my mind, but no, I'm happy I've got these numbers. I'm going to stick with this fact that this patient is not significantly bleeding. What I don't want to do is call a code red and then turn up and it's 2 severely broken arms, but there's no sign of any catastrophic hemorrhage here. So, one final set to go. So if you've been to the Royal London, you drive past the front of the hospital, you do a left turn, you come into the side road, and then you do a left turn again. You go past Nido's Kebab House, and it was pretty much at that point that we got the final blood pressure reading. Okay, so the heart rate's still going up. Saturations, they're not 81%, they're sort of intermittently recording, but we can't really use the fingertip because of the wrist injury. And I think at this point we had it attached to the nose, but it was a finger probe on a nose. It's not really designed for that purpose. But we've got this blood pressure of 58/40. And I think at that point the penny dropped. This is what we'd probably been dealing with the whole way. This patient was significantly hypovolemic. And I arrived into Royal London, handed over to the trauma team. They immediately got some blood products ready, but left feeling somewhat dejected, very self-critical of my own performance, kicking myself that I'd been falsely reassured by a number of readings that I knew to be erroneous, but for some reason felt like I would prefer to believe them than disbelieve them. And for lack of other parameters that would convince me otherwise, had made the decision that this patient was not as sick as he turned out to be. As we left the hospital, the crew said, I think the patient's just gone into traumatic arrest. They were doing a thoracotomy. So I felt even worse. And on the way back to my car, because those of you who've done basics type responding, there's a lonely journey where you've then got to find yourself getting back to your own vehicle and then getting back to your home address. And actually the next day I was scheduled to go to a trauma conference, funnily enough. Attended that trauma conference with one of my colleagues. And it was about halfway through the day when I was just flicking through social media in one of the breaks that I came across the news that this patient had unfortunately deceased from his injuries. They had managed to get a return of spontaneous circulation in the hospital after the thoracotomy. They took him to theatre, they did a laparotomy, couldn't actually find the particular source of significant hemorrhage, but essentially the patient passed away of multi-organ failure the next morning. I don't remember much of the rest of the conference that day. I don't think my brain was really in it because I was too busy self-criticising and trying to understand why I'd made the decisions that I did. And I vowed at that point that I was going to get better. Rob's talked about performance. and that I wasn't going to make those same decisions again, and I was going to understand at a deeper level why I made the decisions that I did. So that was how I made my decisions. What I want to do now, though, is to ask you to make some decisions. So I'm going to give you a series of 3 small problems. Nothing too complex. Some of you may have seen them before, and if you can't read them, I'll read them out. So a bat and a ball cost $1.10 in total. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Quite simple, shouldn't need to give you too long. Anyone thinking 10 cents? You don't have to put your hands up, don't worry. If you thought 10 cents, it's a good guess, but it's wrong. If you thought 5 cents, you're correct. Well done. I'll give you a proportion of how many people get these questions correct at the end. And if some of you are wondering how on earth it's 5 cents, go and have a look later on Google. There's lots of people debating it on forums as to how it could be 5 or 10 or 15. Okay, next one. So if it takes 5 machines 5 minutes to make 5 widgets, how long would it take 100 machines to make 100 widgets? Where's Tony Kemp? I feel like I'm back doing auctioneering again. Anyone go for 100 minutes? 100 minutes, you're wrong. 5 minutes, you're correct. Again, look up on the internet if you want to have the worked out solution. So in a lake, there's a patch of lily pads. Every day, this patch doubles in size. If it takes 48 days for the patch to cover the entire lake, how long does it take to cover half the lake? A little bit of maths for you on a Wednesday afternoon. 24 days. Good guess if you thought 24 days, but even better if you said 47 days, because 47 days is the right answer. Anyone get all 3 correct? Okay, the data's probably about right then. So in the population, 17% of people get 3 correct. If you get 2 correct, or more than 1 correct, 1 or 2 correct, you're in with 83% of the population. If you didn't get any correct, well, 33% of the population didn't get any right either. If you have a very high IQ and get selected to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, congratulations, well done. But only 48% of their new graduates, or their new undergraduates, should I say, sorry, got 3 out of 3 correct. So don't be too disheartened if you didn't get them all correct. But it's not a test of intelligence, it's about how you think. Okay? So those of you that thought 10 cents for the price of the ball, that was your system 1, your fast system of thinking, pushing you down that avenue very quickly to make a snap decision based on your gut feeling. Okay, that's how we make the vast majority of our decisions during the day. That's how we function as humans, because if we all took slow, deliberate decisions about every small decision in life, we wouldn't get anywhere. System 1, as you see at the top, relies on us identifying a pattern. And when we recognize that, we can quickly come up with the answer. So, if you see a 70-year-old who's a smoker who presents with severe central crushing chest pain on the left-hand side, it's radiating down to his left arm and his jaw, and he tells you last year he had a heart attack, then chances are you're going to recognize that pattern. This is going to be a myocardial infarction, and you're going to very quickly do an ECG, give him some GTN, and potentially off you go to the cath lab. If, however, you're presented with a 13-year-old with a diffuse headache on the right-hand side, a rash that's only localized to the area around the umbilicus and has developed back pain and left-sided weakness, that doesn't fit any pattern that I remember seeing previously. That's not going to be very easily dealt with through my system 1 thinking, and I'm going to have to start doing some more deliberate testing and try different hypotheses to try and work out what the problem is. Some of you will have used some system 2 thinking when you dealt with those questions, because you'll have tested your answer. You'll have tried 10 cents as the price of that ball. You'll have put it into the final calculation and gone, well, no, it can't be 10 cents because then the bat would only cost $1, and actually the difference between those is 90 cents, not $1. And if you do that, then you've actually used a bit of system 2 to combat your initial system 1 that's too quickly worked out the gut feel answer. And that's why we have these overrides. So you can see there, the rational override, where if you've gone down system 1 too quickly, your brain kicks in and says, hang on a minute, JB, you've gone a little bit too quick there, you're getting a bit ahead of yourself, slow it down, take in some of the other information, and actually be a bit more deliberate with your thinking, and you might come to the right answer. However, likewise, we can go the other way when we're going through system 2 and very quickly realise that we're being too slow and methodical over this, and actually we do recognise this pattern, we've seen it before, and move back into system 1. For those of you that like to see things in a different format, this is a different way of thinking about the two systems. So system 1 being our fast system, happens with unconscious, effortless, it's automatic. These things are happening without our input. But you're limited. You're only seeing what you want to see. You're not taking in the whole of the periphery. Compared to system 2, much more slow, deliberate, absorbing all of the information, testing the hypothesis, making sure that it works before you come to the final conclusion. So, what drives us and what makes us use these different systems, and what can affect and cause flaws in our thinking? Well, the main thing is all of these different reasons, and they're in legion. This is a small snapshot, a small word cloud of all of the different cognitive biases that are affecting you on a daily basis when you're making decisions. If you want to see it in a different way, you can use that codex, but there's over 188 different cognitive biases that are listed up there, ranging from too much information to not enough information, information not coming quickly enough, to information coming too quickly. But there's just a few that I want to highlight that I think are important to us as PHEM clinicians. So, effective error. So I was almost certainly affected by this cognitive bias. I wanted this patient to get to hospital and to be well. I didn't want to believe that he was as sick as he was. I'd listened to his story. I'd heard that he'd been motorcycling through Italy for the last 2 weeks. He was a mile away from home when a driver crossed onto the wrong side of the road and hit him head on. And subconsciously, I was hoping that the worst injury he had was just 2 very nasty open fractured wrists, not the legion of other injuries that he could potentially have had. And that is our natural way of being. We want people, we don't go out hoping that every single patient we see today is going to be a cardiac arrest. Anchoring bias, diagnosis, momentum. So I like to think of this as a piece of snow. As that piece of snow starts rolling, it starts gathering more snow, like when you're building a snowman in the garden. And think of that when you start off with that diagnosis, when you see that patient with chest pain, suddenly it's metamorphed into this is almost certainly an LAD MI, when you haven't actually had that much information to support that. Availability, recent case and significant case bias. It's a big challenge, especially in those when we see patients and when we've been involved in serious incidents, because you can guarantee if you've had a serious incident, you've been investigated for a misdiagnosis, the next 100 patients that you're going to see, no matter what the presentation, you're always going to be suspicious of that potential significant case. And confirmation bias, again, carries over a lot from aviation, but we see that when we seek information that helps to prove our diagnosis and we ignore the things that disprove it. Coming on to final 4 then, order effects, in that we tend to prioritize that information at the beginning of the story and at the end of the story and forget a lot in the middle. So important to think about when we're handing over patients. Premature closure and search satisfaction, where we find a significant injury and then that's it, we've got it, we've nailed it, we've found this injury, that's what's going on, but we miss the other potential small, subtle things down the line. Triage queuing, so important to think about when we look at what's given over the terminal on the vehicle. This is a C3 call, this is going to be a load of rubbish. Actually, it turns out to be somebody who's having a significant event, just versus how we respond to the C1 call, when actually the pathology can be exactly the same. It's just how the patient's described it. And then zebra retreat. So it's not a safari park, unfortunately. This is basically, especially for junior clinicians, a big problem in that we tend to not want to call these rare diagnoses in our differentials for fear of being laughed at, for fear of being wrong, for fear of over-egging it when actually it's going to be something much more simple. So we tend to find a lot of junior people tend to go for the more common diagnoses in the differential rather than those rarer pathologies, not because they don't know about it, but because they're afraid of making the wrong, suggesting the wrong decision. And occasionally you get the converse of that where people are so desperately trying to find the rare things, they forget about the common things. And all of the cognitive biases is a converse to each one of them. So being aware of them is the key. There are some specific risk factors for where you're more likely to be affected by these things. So when you're cognitively overloaded, you're making lots of decisions in a very short space of time. Interruptions and distractions have been mentioned by Rob. Our smartphone's a great tool, but I'll talk about some of the potential distractions there. When we're tired, so when we're doing nights, when we're doing shifts, we're much more likely to be prone to be affected by these biases. How can we deal with it? Well, actually just knowing about them is a great step. Thinking about alternatives and coming up with a differential diagnosis for every patient we see rather than just settling on one diagnosis. Using metacognition and reflection, so actually understanding how you've made your decisions, rather than thinking about what to think about how to think. Decrease reliance on memory, so use the smartphone for what it's good at. It's got huge processing power there. Think about how you might incorporate decision-making into simulation. Take away simulation just being used for technical skills. A lot of people using it for non-technical skills, human factors, CRM. But actually, how many of you have used a simulation to specifically focus on the decision-making aspects? Task simplification, so utilizing cognitive aids to take away some of the mental bandwidth on some of the more easily simplified tasks, and getting feedback. So that's crucial to the whole of today, but making sure that when we're giving feedback, when we're debriefing, we include feedback on the decision-making process. And you can only feedback on that effectively if you understand some of the potential pitfalls in the decisions that we make. So I mentioned about smartphones. They're the weapons of mass distraction. Obviously, none of you are going to be out on Facebook when you're treating a patient, but even think about that potential negative thing you've read on Facebook or Twitter 5 minutes before the alarm goes or you go to a job. It could still be playing on your mind when you then next encounter that patient interaction. So just be wary. That's it about metacognition. I hope you found it useful. I'm around for the rest of the day. As I say, pet subject, love talking about it, so please find me and ask questions.
Thank you.